Hey everyone, today we'll be talking about the United States during its very first few years of independence. By the end of the video, I hope that you'll be able to answer these questions. What systems of government did the new colonies establish after breaking away from Britain? What did the governments of the different states have in common? What were the Articles of Confederation? And how did the war affect the American economy? Also, I want you to know what a constitution is and what the Articles of Confederation were. So let's start by talking about how the new states went about governing themselves. So after the Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies became states, and that meant that they had to figure out for themselves how they were going to govern themselves. And so this is a pretty daunting task because this means that 13 new independent countries, more or less, are going to decide how their government is going to work. And what's interesting is that each colony basically sets up their own government by writing a constitution. And a constitution is basically a set of laws that determine how a country will work. And so each colony, aka state, now writes a constitution as if it were an independent country. And so the Constitution is the highest set of laws in a country. It is the set of laws that no other law can contradict. And these sets of laws, constitutions, are purposefully difficult to change. They make it really hard to alter these laws. That way people have to learn to work within a given system. This helps to make government stable. And the main thing that constitutions do is they say what the rules are for how the government will work. It will say we'll have elections, we'll elect these kinds of people, these people will have these kinds of powers. It basically sets out as clearly as possible how a government is going to work. And so all of the different constitutions that are set up in all of the 13 new states have some important similarities. And one of the most important similarities is that they all extend the franchise to poorer white males. That is, they let poorer white males vote. And you may remember that before in the colonies there was some self-government, but it was only fairly wealthy white males that were allowed to vote. That meant you had to own a lot of property. But in the new states, the bar is lowered, and people with not very much property are allowed to vote. That is, white and male people. Everybody else, regardless of how much property they own, is not allowed to vote. So the states set up their own systems of government, but that means you have 13 independent countries that have replaced the 13 colonies. But the colonies realize that if they don't work together, they're going to be pretty weak and vulnerable. So they all agree that they need to set up some kind of central government. That is, a government that unites all 13 states into a single country. But the question is, how is this type of government going to help? And how is it going to work? Well, the very first central government was the Second Continental Congress, which is the one that wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was basically just an assembly of leaders from different colonies. And they weren't elected, they were just kind of sent, and they didn't have any clearly defined power. And this made it hard for them to do what they needed to do. They eventually wrote for themselves a set of laws determining how the central government would work, and this was called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were a very problematic set of laws that didn't really work out in the long run. And we're going to be talking about this in much greater detail in the next slideshow. But basically what you need to know now is that the 13 states are doubtful of setting up a strong central government. They just got rid of an oppressive king, and what they want to do is make sure that their freedom, which they fought a war for, is preserved. So they don't want to hand over too much power to any central government. And for this reason, the Articles of Confederation set up an extremely weak central government. The first government of the United States is very, very weak and can't really tell the individual states what to do. This has important problems that we'll talk about in the next slideshow. On top of setting up a new system of government, the new United States also has to deal with a lot of economic changes, some of which are good, some of which are not so good. So the first thing about the U.S. economy is that the U.S. becomes more and more a nation of small farmers. That is, independent people who own their own land and grow crops and then either feed them or trade them or sell them to make a living. And what's interesting about America is that most people own their own land. And this is important and very different from Europe, where land is held by very few, very wealthy people. But in America, lots of people own their own land. And one thing that contributes to this is that during the Revolutionary War, a lot of land was confiscated from very, very rich loyalists. A lot of loyalists tended to be extremely wealthy, and when their land was confiscated, their vast territories were split up and given out to other American citizens, often Americans who participated in the Revolutionary War. And one thing that this contributed to is something that is sometimes known as economic democracy. And what this is that basically lots and lots of people in America were kind of equal in terms of the amount of wealth that they had. Rather than a few very, very rich people and many very, very poor people, in America what you had were lots of people who were kind of in the middle. That is, a middle class, a nation of small farmers. And this idea of a large middle class was something that the Americans valued back then, and it's something that people in America still value nowadays. On top of this spread of small farmers, you also see the beginning of American industry. And so before the Revolution, most Americans depended on Great Britain to get all the stuff they needed made in factories. But during the Revolution, the boycotts, that is the time when people stop buying British goods, gives American industry the chance to develop. That is, American factories can pop up and start making the stuff that people would have otherwise just bought from Great Britain. And this really helps the American factories get started. But there are some serious costs and some serious benefits to being independent. Things are really quite different now. The major cost is that it gets really hard to trade with Britain, because Britain only wants to trade with its own colonies. So that means that the US, now that it's declared independence, is kind of kicked out of the club, and it has to find other people to trade with. Fortunately, now that it doesn't have to listen to the navigation laws anymore, the United States can trade with any other country. So it can trade with Spain and France and all the other European and Asian nations. And so it's hard to say which one is better or worse, but it's just a huge shift for the Americans to start trading with everybody else and to give up British trade. One last thing that's really important to think about for the early years of the United States is that they are surrounded by enemies. To the north, up in Canada, there is Great Britain, who is really still quite unhappy about losing its colonies. And one thing that the British do is they refuse to abandon forts along the American border. So even though they've given territory to America, the British don't really give it up right away. And the Americans are too weak to go and take the forts, so Britain just keeps them. Also, Britain refuses to trade with America, and they hope that this will weaken the American economy enough to give them an opportunity to reclaim some of their American empire. America is also threatened by Spain, and now Spain controls all of America west of the Mississippi and also Florida. And Spain is hoping to block America and to increase its power on the continent. And so the first thing they do is they block American access to the Mississippi River. Basically, they say, you're not allowed to use this river. And this really hurts the Western American economy because they're dependent on the Mississippi River for transportation. The Spanish also begin to build forts in the south in order to block Southern expansion in that direction. Also, they ally with a number of Native American tribes in order to threaten the southern states. And all of this, Spain is hoping, will help them to expand their control into American territory. And the young United States, because they distrust each other and they're going through all of these growing pains, they don't have the organization needed to basically stand up to these guys and assert themselves in the territory that is supposedly theirs. So that's it for today's lesson. In the next few days, we're going to see how America tries to deal with all of these issues.